This is Life with Psychic Suzanna on 1110 KFAB. Helping you find emotional, spiritual, and physical balance. What does your future hold? It's time to find out with Psychic Suzanna.
Yes, you are right where you need to be. This is Life with Psychic Suzanna on 1110 KFAB. You can find us, and if you don't know, we want you to know that you can find us at PsychicSuzanna.com or KFAB.com. At PsychicSuzanna.com, you get a free question. I answer it usually within a week. On KFAB.com, you have all of the shows that have ever been up there that we've ever done. They are listed on the website, and great information is accessible to you in the moment. This show is all about empowering you and helping you to find answers to your life questions. This show is centered around making you happy and healthy and emotionally secure. Please join us on 2 Facebook accounts. One is Life with Psychic Suzanna. There you get the inside knowledge of where to contact me. And also you get a little inside knowledge of who's coming on the show. And then go to Susanna Stickney. You find out what's going on in my life. And I also try to give you every day one intention that I'm working on. And then I ask you to join me on working on the intention. This show, it's all about empowerment. And we're going to have an author on. If you were on Life with Psychic Suzanna on Facebook, you would have heard about this. This is Dr. Brad Sachs. Welcome to the show, Dr. Sachs.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, now, Dr. Sachs, you are really a prolific writer, and the 2 books we're going to cover now, we're going to bring you back on to talk about the other books because there's so many great information there. The 2 books we want to talk about now is The Good Enough Child and The Good Enough Teen. And what is a good enough child? Before we start this, how long have you been practicing psychology?
Well, I've been probably almost 30 years at this point.
Really?
Yeah, so it's been several decades.
And what brought you into psychology, going into psychology? What was your motivation?
Well, that's a good question because it wasn't a direct path, as it isn't for many. I was originally a teacher, actually, and I began taking some classes on child psychology just as a way of, advancing my degree and my expertise, and found myself getting very interested in child and family psychology. So at a certain point, I decided to jump tracks and move into the clinical realm and leave the educational realm partially behind.
Okay. And as you did this, what then made you decide to write the books that you have written?
Well, the books that I write, really do emerge from the themes and the concerns and issues that I confront in my practice. And one of the themes that certainly was emerging very saliently was parents who wanted their children to be perfect and expected themselves to be perfect parents as well. And it's not only an impossible enterprise, but it's an exhausting and demoralizing enterprise as well. So hearing these themes and hearing this narrative that kept showing up in the families that I was working with, it occurred to me that it might be useful to try to address it with a book and try to take the edge off of some of the anxiety and fretfulness that so many modern families encounter.
So what is a good enough child? What would we say a good enough child? And I understand that wanting to be the perfect parent, but boy, it's a learning process, isn't it?
Well, by nature, the parent-child relationship is an imperfect relationship. Any love or intimate relationship is an imperfect relationship. And, we grow and evolve through these relationships by coming to terms with our flaws and our imperfections, not by imagining that they're not there or trying to constantly transcend them. And that's the message that I'm giving to parents, is that we want our children to be feeling as if they're loved and accepted and adored, not for being who we want them to be, but simply for being who they are. And when parents can bring that attitude of openness and warmth and acceptance to their children, natural growth and development tend to take over, and children grow up into masterful, competent adults. But when all we can see are their shortcomings, all we can focus on is how they don't measure up, that's when the relationship between the parent and the child starts to get a little corroded, and it really interferes with the child's development and mastery.
So when we're talking about a good enough child, or what was the name of the book with a good enough family? What was that?
Well, the subtitle, The Good Enough Child, is How to Have an Imperfect Family and Be Perfectly Satisfied.
So that basically means how to not be kicking yourself in the tush because you don't have all the answers.
Yes, and there is no book that has all the answers, and we sure wish that there was. But, most of us, no matter how compassionate we are, no matter how educated we are, no matter how committed and conscientious we are, we're going to make plenty of mistakes as parents, and children are entitled to make their own mistakes. And again, the key is to keep that bond of love and connection and warmth intact, even as we disappoint and disillusion ourselves, which we all will inevitably do. This happens in marriages, it happens in the parent-child relationship, it happens between all the generations. And, we have to broaden our definition of what family love is all about beyond just doing exactly what others expect us to do.
Okay. We're going to take a little break right now, and then we're going to come back with more of your question, more of your insightfulness. And the thing we want to come back is, how do we nurture our family? How do we nurture our child so we feel safe? You are listening to Life with Psychic Suzanna, 1110 KFAB. Stay tuned. Grow with us. We're getting smart here.
Life with Psychic Suzanna on 1110 KFAB. She knew I was going to say that.
This is Life with Psychic Suzanna on 1110 KFAB. Please stay tuned because we're talking to Dr. Brad Sachs. He's written quite a few books, and the books we're talking about is The Good Enough Teen and The Good Enough Child, and he's going to help us understand how to be peaceful in all the drama that family bring to us. Please note, you can find us at PsychicSuzanna.com, where you get a free question, KFAB.com. You're going to want to re-listen to this interview. It'll be put up there by Tuesday with Scott. Right now, we're going to Dr. Brad Sachs. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Sachs.
It's always a pleasure.
Okay. Now, Dr. Sachs, we're handed this beautiful baby, and we're trying to assimilate how to be the perfect mother. And then, I always tell people the best form of birth control is to tell your children that they're not going to have babies, but teenagers. And so they come through this when they're about 9 through, it starts at 9, and there's that thing. So how do we nurture our family so it stays healthy? How do we nurture our child so the child doesn't go into that teen years with such drama?
Well, I don't think it's possible to prevent that drama during adolescence because that drama is absolutely essential.
Why?
Because that's how you forge your own identity. The way that you start to become your own person is to begin to unplug or disinvest or bump up against what you've been taught and what you have learned so you can figure out which parts of your childhood you want to keep with you and what you want to leave behind. And so I'm not saying it has to be a terribly turbulent time, and there's certainly problems that can be prevented. There's certainly better ways to handle some of the drama, but to imagine that you can avoid it or prevent it, I think is actually mistaken. And one of the things that I often tell families is sometimes the worst conflicts in the family result from our efforts to avoid conflict. Parents are so convinced that there's something wrong because there's tension or because there's irritability or because there's contentiousness, and they work very hard to quash it or to quell it or to avoid it or ignore it. And that actually sets the stage for larger problems because every child has to learn how to separate and differentiate, and you cannot do that without a certain amount of tension and drama.
Now, what if one of our children or our teenagers starts all of a sudden becoming real quiet? And, they say, watch these signs, your kids might be getting in a bad group. Or don't we have to be alert to how our son or daughter is behaving?
Yeah, you constantly want to be aware of what your son or daughter is doing. And you're absolutely right. At times, some of the behaviors that teenagers are displaying are, in fact, worrisome. But the problem in our culture is that we've so narrowed and so restricted the definition of what normal is that the slightest deviation is defined as some sort of pathology or diagnosis, and that becomes a very big problem. So if children are shy, they're diagnosed as having a social anxiety disorder. If children are very active and intense, they're diagnosed with an attentional deficiency. If they tend to be introspective and quiet, they're diagnosed with depression. And I'm not saying that these disorders do not occur. What I'm saying is that we label everybody when there's that slightest departure from this artificial mean. And we do our children a great disservice because we dehumanize them when we attribute everything that they're doing to some sort of misalignment of their chemistry or some sort of imbalance in their neurology.
Wow. Okay. Tell me the difference between, as we're, say, disciplining or talking to our children, the difference between preparation and performance. So when we see our child that is not performing like we think, how do we help them? What is that preparation?
Well, most communication between parent and child tends to be aligned with our telling them what we think and what we believe they ought to be doing. And it's much more important, particularly as children are growing through childhood into adolescence, to try to attract their curiosity about why they're doing what they're doing. Because once children understand more about their inner life, once they start to map out that interior terrain, they'll become naturally inquisitive about why they do what they do, and they'll begin to monitor or regulate or modulate themselves. And that's the key to communication between parents and children at any age, not just telling them what we think and not just telling them what the standards or expectations are, but getting them interested in why they do what they do. And that's really the best preparation for young adulthood, is understanding that. And the other thing,
you're saying just because I said so is not a good enough thing.
Well,
that causes conflict, because I believe that does too. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's legitimate. You know, ultimately, parents have to pull rank at times. I'm not saying, that they should abdicate their authority, but they have to do. They have to not only be able to draw the line and set the limit and back it up, but they have to help the young adult or even the young child understand what he or she is doing,
Mm-hmm. So, as we're working with our child, trying to help them, what is this I ask all my authors to send me 5 questions. What do you mean when you talk about forgiving your child? What is that all about?
We often confine the concept of forgiveness to situations in which an individual has violated us or an individual has hurt us. But forgiveness is also necessary and essential when someone has disappointed or disillusioned us. And when we begin parenthood, what we do is we begin this process of making tremendous sacrifices and compromises and investments in them, and we expect to be paid back in some sort of currency that's meaningful for us. We want our child to be successful or popular or accomplished or a high achiever. And the reality is that's not a contract that the child ever signed. Part of parenthood is making those sacrifices and compromises, but we have to understand that they're still entitled to live their own life. And when they do that, they're going to disappoint and disillusion us, and that's when forgiveness becomes absolutely essential. We have to forgive them for being who they are rather than who we want them to be. And we
that's an interesting concept. So if I'm a baseball coach, and I really want my son to play baseball, but he doesn't like it.
Right.
I have to look at myself and forgive him for not liking what I want him to like.
Exactly.
And stop pushing him towards being something he doesn't feel he can be.
Right. Or he could be, but it wouldn't feel like his true self. And that's when children and adolescents run into trouble, is when they're living their parents' lives rather than their own lives. And if they constantly feel like they're disappointing their parents and their parents can't let go of their disappointment, if the parents can't forgive them for being who they are rather than who the parent wants them to be, that's when children do run into trouble, because they start to feel frustrated and exasperated by being unable to elicit any kind of parental blessing or approval.
Wow, that's very interesting. Tell me about how are some of the ways that parents react when children disappoint them or disillusion them that is not healthy for the child?
We all have sort of these reflexive responses when our children disappoint us, and usually the origin of these is in how our parents responded to us when we disappointed them, since, of course, we disappointed our parents just like our children will disappoint us. Sometimes we get over-anxious and we exaggerate the depth or the breadth of the problem that they're displaying. Sometimes we just pull away from them and get angry and withdrawn. Sometimes we push them harder and, forcing them to dig their heels in. There's a range of responses that we all will tend to do. And we're not going to make those tendencies go away, but we want to be aware of them, because when we're aware of them, that's when we can take the edge off of them and soften them. And that's where the healing powers or the curative properties of forgiveness become relevant, because instead of just reacting irritably because our son doesn't want to be the baseball player that we envisioned him to be, we can embrace him for being who he is, and then he's more likely to feel successful and accomplished at something that's meaningful to him.
Okay, we're going to take a little break. We're coming back, and Doctor, I'd like to hold you over after the 8 o'clock hour. We're coming back in a minute, but I just want everyone to know that you are so filled with knowledge that we can use, that we want to take care and get all we can out of this time with you. We are going to come back. When we come back, I'm going to ask you how we can have the child find his true self. How do we help the child see what it is that he needs to see? This is Life with Psychic Suzanna. This is 1110 KFAB. You don't belong any other place but right here.
This is Life with Psychic Suzanna on 1110 KFAB.
Yes, this is Life with Psychic Suzanna on 1110 KFAB. Please find us at PsychicSuzanna.com. Get a free question. Go to KFAB.com. And if you're an insider with Life with Psychic Suzanna on Facebook, you get to find out who's coming up on air with us. And today we're very honored to have Dr. Brad Sachs. Welcome to the show.
I am glad to be here.
I've got to tell you, I have my landlady next to me. Her name's Lisa, and she's just coming into watching the show, and she told me that you are brilliant. So I'm going to take it from there. If my landlady believes that, I'm going to believe it. Lisa knows what she talks. She also talked about her child being diagnosed with ADHD. She took him to a physician. Instead of the physician giving him drugs, they worked with her constantly to help her daughter. Is that something you find often, that drugs could be the problem, that we want to drug our children rather than help them find their true self?
I don't think there's any question that medication, which is appropriately prescribed after careful diagnosis, prevents and relieves unnecessary suffering. But the problem is it's rarely, or not as much as we would like, carefully prescribed after a thoughtful diagnostic process. And, there's a lot of pressure on clinicians to come up with a quick fix, and we would love to fantasize that everything can be reduced to our neurocircuitry, but I think development and maturation are much, much more complicated than that. And interestingly, my wife is a psychiatrist and, who specializes in pharmacology, and, she's often telling patients to be a lot more realistic about what medication can and can't do, and as your landlady was saying about her experience, to realize that there's many, many solutions and strategies that can be implemented in addition to or even instead of medication. So I don't think it's all bad, obviously, and like I said, it has great value in many, many situations, but we turn to it much more quickly, and there's always side effects, whether they're physical side effects or whether there's emotional side effects, and that's what we have to be more attentive to.
Well, and I think the thing that I believe is great about my landlady is she's involved with her child, and being involved with your child is what we're talking about. How do we help our child find their true self?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. The key is some measure of involvement. And what I always tell parents is children are much more likely to grow and develop in right ways and in the best ways if they know that they're going to be loved and accepted simply for being who they are. And that's what children have a hard time hearing in this culture, because they're constantly being told what they're not and how they're not measuring up and why they're flawed or why they deviate or what diagnosis or label that they have, rather than being told, what's right about them and what's good about them. And the other piece that I think is confusing for parents is that, they've often been misled into thinking that a child's self-esteem depends on how much they're praised or how much they're reinforced or rewarded. And that really has very little to do with self-esteem and self-concept. The basis for self-esteem is being able to handle responsibilities well. And when parents teach children to be responsible and to contribute in meaningful ways at home, in the community, at church or synagogue or mosque or wherever, that becomes the essential foundation for a child's positive self-regard, not just telling them that they're terrific at everything they do.
I come from a place of a very strong faith. So what I always tell people with children that act up, it's that you have to separate the action from the individual. So you love them constantly, but you don't like the action. Is that a great way of saying it? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a very, very important distinction, to help disentangle the child's being from the child's behavior. And that's, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, one of the ways in which we make life very difficult for parents as well as children is that we focus on simplifying them or oversimplifying them. And children are complicated individuals with a range of initiatives and desires and conflicts and dilemmas that have to be sorted out. And that's not a medical issue, and that's not a neurological issue. These are existential issues that every child and teenager and eventually young adult has to be able to come to terms with. And that requires involvement. That's probably the best word to use. Careful, attentive, thoughtful, patient, persistent involvement. And children know instantly whether that involvement is in place or not.
We are going to come back with you after the top of the hour. I'm going to want to talk about how the child experiences 3 births. We're going to come back. This is Life with Psychic Suzanna. After we come back, we're going to also be taking your calls right here, 558-1110. Yes, this is Life with Psychic Suzanna on 1110 KFAB. Now you can always find us at PsychicSuzanna.com. You get the schedule of where I'm at, where I'm appearing. I'm in town this week. Also, you can ask one free question. Please also go to KFAB.com. And then we'll be talking. You can have all of these shows that we've ever done online, so you can listen to them. Dr. Brad Sachs is the guy I've been telling you about if you belong to Life with Psychic Suzanna on Facebook or Susanna Stickney. You get some inside knowledge of who's going to be on the show, so please join us. Dr. Brad Sachs, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me here.
Okay. Now, you've written two books that we're talking about today. The book is The Good Enough Child and The Good Enough Teen. You are giving us quite a bit of information. Before we go back to our couple of discussions, tell us how we find you.
The easiest way is I do have a website, and it's just my name, Dr. Brad Sachs, www.drbradSachs.com.
Okay, and your books are listed there, and you can also go online and find them.
Right.
The question we want to talk about, and as we round up the end of this conversation, by the way, you also have a Facebook, is that correct?
There's a fan page, I guess, so you can get more information.
Okay.
Like an author's page, I guess.
Okay. As we wrap this up, let's talk about what do you mean when you say that every child experiences 3 births?
Well, I talk about that because all parents have a fantasy child in mind. This is the child who really is perfect, who's going to fulfill all of their wishes and make good on all the promises and just be the child that makes them feel wonderful about themselves as individuals. And that's the first birth. And we have that fantasy child, the birth of that fantasy child well before we even become parents. Mm-hmm. And then we actually become parents. And that's the birth of what I call the flesh and blood child, the real child. And this is the child who, as we've been talking about earlier, is doomed and destined to disappoint us, to frustrate us, to disillusion us. Because that's the nature of child development. Children are there to become their own people, not to become the person that we want them to be. And so the key to parenthood is integrating this child, the fantasy child and the real-life child, and come up with the good enough child. And the good enough child is the child who, as we've been saying, is loved and accepted and respected for being who he or she is rather than who we want him or her to be. And the process of parenthood goes best when we acknowledge that we have this fantasy child and this real-life child, and we've got to weave those two children together, not let go of either of them, but embroider them together so that we can begin to see the child as good enough. And when we do that, the child begins to see him or herself as good enough and set his or her own expectations, and that's the key. Because when we have expectations that are too high for our children, they're inevitably feeling bad about themselves because they're disappointing us. But if we have expectations that are too low, we're not really allowing them or encouraging them to aim high. So the key is for them to define their expectations for themselves, and most children will do that in very natural and healthy ways.
Do you think it's healthy that we have children? My child read at 4 months or walked at 9 months. Your child, so my child was ahead, and we start doing that competition with other children. Is that healthy or motivating? I mean, do we push our children too much, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we live in a culture that greatly values and valorizes achievement and competition and rivalrousness, and I think it's mistaken. Development is not a race, and the first one out of the block isn't always the one who wins the race anyway. But, yeah, parents put tremendous pressure on themselves by feeling as if, their child is behind because he's not tying his shoes yet or she's not in a dance class yet. And we make things unnecessarily difficult on our children and on ourselves by having these unrealistic expectations. And so it's important for children to be trusted and to understand that we as parents have faith in them, that they're going to grow and develop and evolve in healthy ways without having to be the first or on top of the heap.
Well, I love your statement, development is not a race. I like that. That almost puts a breather in being a parent. Let's talk about, do we get our children over activities? I mean, some parents, you just become a carpool. You take them to dance, you take them to voice, you take them to things. Do we outsource our children too much in activities, do you think?
Well,
how many activities is healthy for a child to be in a school?
First of all, it has to be a conversation between parent and child. And that's the problem, is that parents feel like they have to arbitrarily make these decisions without consulting with or reading where their child is at. I don't think it's fair to fault or condemn parents for having their children in activities because, a lot of parents aren't as available as they'd like to be, or, a situation where money is tight or their backs are to the wall and, both parents do have to work very hard. Family life is very different than it was a generation ago, and I think it would be a mistake, to simply feel like we suffer in comparison. But on the flip side, I do think that children are overscheduled, and I think we minimize the importance of having time to imagine, to think, and to play. Those are processes that are absolutely essential for the child to construct his or her own identity. And if they're constantly being scheduled and structured and monitored and supervised, they don't have as much of that time to blossom and develop.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one scenario. I'm looking forward to our conversation that we have scheduled later. I'm going to ask you one scenario, and then I'm going to ask for your ideas on how to handle it.
Sure.
I'm a phenomenal mother. I love my child. My child has sung in the choir for all of her life. All of a sudden, she comes home or played soccer all of his life, and then comes home and says, I don't want to do this anymore. And say there was a fee, and I've been paying a fee to make sure they do soccer, and paying a fee to make sure they sing. So do I let them quit an action that they've committed to at the beginning? Is that healthy for them or not?
Well, There's a lot of answers to that question, a lot of ways to answer it. I mean, first of all, like I said, the key isn't what you do or you don't do as a parent. The key is the extent to which you include the child in some dialogue or conversation about this and help them understand the ramifications of whatever decision they make. Now, the situations can be very different. For example, if a child started playing baseball, committed to a team, the team is counting on him, and halfway through he says, I really don't like this team or this coach anymore, I think it is legitimate for parents to say, look, not only did we pay money for this and you said you wanted to do it, but also this is a team effort and the team is counting on you. So we're going to expect you to finish out the season, and we expect you to do it to the best of your ability. But at the end of this season, should you be done with baseball, even if you've been doing it for 4 years or 8 years or 12 years, and even if we think a scholarship is in the offing because you're such a fine baseball player, that's entirely up to you. Because, again, that goes back to respecting the child's capacity to determine what he or she knows is best for him or her to do. And they're the only ones who know the answer to that question. Parents don't know it. Teachers don't know it. Coaches don't know it. The child knows it. And we have to give them a chance to understand and map out their internal cartography so they can make that blueprint for their life.
I want to thank you greatly for being on the show with us. This is Dr. Brad Sachs. Please go to his website to find out more about him, and his books are phenomenal. Dr. Brad Sachs, S-A-C-H. Thank you for being with us, and we'll look forward to our future conversations.
It'll be a delight, I'm sure.
God bless. This is Life with Psychic Suzanna. We're coming back with your calls. Please get on the phone line. The number is 1-800-543-1110, 558-1110. We are listening. We want to hear what's on your mind. Again, 558-1110, 1-800-543-1110. This is Life with Psychic Suzanna. This is KFAB.
Psychic Suzanna.
Can't get through on the radio show? Call Psychic Suzanna anytime at 712-276-9349. That's 712-276-9349. Or visit her webpage, PsychicSuzanna.com.
Yes, you're right where you need to be. This is Life with Psychic Suzanna on 1110 KFAB. Please find us at PsychicSuzanna.com. You get a free question. You get to know where I'm at. Join me on Facebook, Life with Psychic Suzanna. You get to have an inside touch of who's going to be on the show next week. Next week, we have, just between you and me, we have the author that is going to be on our show before he's on Coast to Coast. Yes, we got a scoop with Eldon coming on, and he's going to be